In 1789, a black man in London published a book that would change the world. His name was on the cover twice. Once as Olaudah Equiano, the name given to him at birth in Africa, and once as Gustavus Vasa, the name forced upon him in slavery. The book sold out 9 times during his lifetime. It was translated into German, Dutch, and Russian, and it helped bring down the entire British slave trade. This is his story. Around 1745, in a village called Eseka, in what's now southeastern Nigeria, a boy was born into an Igbo family of some standing. His father held a position of authority in the community, something like a judge or elder. They named the child Olaudah, which in their language meant fortune or vicissitude, and also signified someone with a commanding voice, someone well-spoken. It was a prophetic name. The Igbo people of this region lived in relative prosperity. They grew their own food, traded with neighboring communities, and maintained their own systems of justice and governance. Young Olaudah grew up in this world, learning the customs of his people, the protocols of cleanliness and ceremony that structured their daily lives. He was his mother's favorite child, and like many youngest sons in privileged families, he expected to follow in his father's footsteps, to one day sit in judgment over disputes, to be a leader among his people. That future ended one afternoon when his parents were working in the fields. Olaudah was about 11 years old. He was at home with his sister when 2 men and a woman climbed over the walls of their family compound. Before the children could cry out for help, before they could even understand what was happening, the kidnappers had them bound and gagged and were carrying them away from everything they'd ever known. What followed was months of trauma that would scar Olaudah for the rest of his life. He and his sister were separated almost immediately. For a child who'd never been more than a few miles from home, who'd never seen white people or sailed on a ship or traveled across water deeper than a river, the journey to the coast must have felt like descending into hell itself. He was sold from one trader to another, marched through unfamiliar territories, kept among strangers who spoke languages he couldn't understand. Sometimes his captors treated him relatively well. He spent time in the household of a chieftain who let him play with the man's son. He lived briefly with a wealthy widow in a town he remembered as Tinma, where he witnessed customs that reminded him of home. But these were just way stations on a path that led inexorably toward the Atlantic coast, toward something he couldn't have imagined in his worst nightmares. When Olaudah finally reached the coast, probably sometime in early 1754, he saw white men for the first time. Their pale skin terrified him. He was convinced they were spirits or demons. When he saw the slave ship waiting in the harbor, its massive structure unlike anything in his experience, he was certain he was going to be eaten. It sounds almost childish to say it that way, but that's what many captured Africans believed. The European traders had been so brutal, so inexplicable in their cruelty, that cannibalism seemed like the only explanation. Why else would they want so many people? Why else would they chain them in the darkness below deck? When Olaudah was carried aboard that ship, when he saw the crowd of black captives already chained in the hold when the stench hit him, that overwhelming mixture of human waste and vomit and sweat and death in an enclosed space, he fainted. It was too much for a child's mind to process. When he came to, he tried to make sense of his surroundings. The ship was crowded far beyond what anyone would consider humane. Each person had barely enough room to lie down, chained so closely to their neighbors that movement was almost impossible. The heat in that airless space was suffocating. People were getting sick everywhere around him. some were dying. When Olaudah refused to eat, the white sailors beat him. The Middle Passage, that journey across the Atlantic that killed millions of Africans, was a voyage into sustained horror. Olaudah watched people die around him every day. He saw sailors throw the dead overboard with no more ceremony than disposing of garbage. He witnessed 3 men attempt to drown themselves by jumping into the ocean rather than endure another day in that floating prison. One of them was caught and whipped so severely that Olaudah wondered if death wouldn't have been more merciful. The ship's crew caught fish for themselves during the voyage. When they had more than they could eat, Olaudah watched them throw the surplus overboard rather than give it to the starving Africans in the hold. That casual cruelty, that deliberate choice to let people suffer when relief would cost nothing, that stayed with him. It was one of the clearest expressions he ever saw of how completely the system of slavery had dehumanized not just the enslaved, but the enslavers themselves. The ship arrived in Barbados in mid-1754. Olaudah was around 11 years old, though the exact date of his birth would be debated by historians centuries later. The enslaved people were taken to a merchant's yard and penned together like livestock. Buyers rushed in to make their selections, grabbing at people, examining them like animals at auction. Families who'd survived the Middle Passage together were torn apart. Brothers were sold in different directions. Olaudah saw them crying out to each other as they were separated, and he thought about the teachings of the Christians who ran this trade, about the commandment to do unto others as you would have them do unto you. It was his first sustained encounter with the profound hypocrisy that would define so much of what he witnessed in the years to come. Olaudah wasn't purchased in Barbados. Instead, he was kept on the ship as it sailed to Virginia. There, he was put to work on a plantation doing light field work and household chores. He was in Virginia less than a year, but it was long enough to see how the system of plantation slavery worked, long enough to witness the casual brutality that white overseers inflicted on black bodies as a matter of routine. In late 1754, a British Royal Navy lieutenant named Michael Henry Pascal purchased Olaudah for somewhere between 30 and 40 pounds. Pascal wasn't buying a field hand. He was buying a personal servant, essentially a status symbol he could give as a gift to his relatives in England. During the voyage to Britain, Pascal renamed his new property. The boy had already been renamed twice since his capture, called Michael on the slave ship and Jacob by his first Virginia owner. Now Pascal decided to call him Gustavus Vasa, after a 16th-century Swedish king who'd led a Protestant Reformation. Olaudah protested. He wanted to keep the name Jacob. His refusal, as he later wrote, gained him many a cuff, many beatings, until he submitted to the new identity. For the rest of his life, in all official records, on all legal documents, he would be Gustavus Vasa. It was only decades later, when he finally had the freedom to write his own story, that he would reclaim the name Olaudah Equiano. But here's the strange thing about Olaudah's enslavement under Pascal. It wasn't what he'd experienced in Virginia, and it wasn't what most enslaved people endured. Pascal took him to England and placed him with the Guerin family, his relatives who lived in London. The Guerin sisters took an interest in the intelligent young African boy. They taught him to read and write. They instructed him in Christianity. In 1759, when Olaudah was about 14 years old, he was baptized at St. Margaret's Church in Westminster. He was receiving an education that most enslaved people never got. He was learning skills that would prove invaluable later in his life. And he was doing it while still being property, still subject to being sold or beaten at his owner's whim, still fundamentally without rights or autonomy or any guarantee of safety. Meanwhile, Britain was at war. The 7 Years' War, that global conflict that pitted Britain and Prussia against France and Austria and their various allies, was raging from 1756 to 1763. Pascal was a naval officer, and he took Olaudah with him to sea. The boy served as what they called a powder monkey, running gunpowder from the magazine to the gun decks during naval battles. It was incredibly dangerous work. One stray spark could cause an explosion that would kill everyone nearby. But for a young teenager who'd grown up thousands of miles from any ocean, who'd been violently ripped from his home and thrust into a world of slavery and war, it was also something else. It was adventure. Olaudah witnessed the siege of Louisbourg in 1758. He was present at the Battle of Lagos in 1759, where Pascal was wounded. He participated in the capture of Belle Isle in 1761. He traveled to England, Holland, Scotland, Gibraltar, and Nova Scotia. He was learning seamanship, picking up the skills of a sailor, becoming comfortable on the ocean that had once terrified him. He made a friend, a white American boy named Richard Baker, and their friendship lasted until Baker's death 2 years later. Olaudah was being shaped by these experiences in ways he couldn't fully understand at the time. But he was still enslaved. And in December 1762, Michael Henry Pascal did what slave owners always had the power to do. He sold Olaudah. There'd been no warning. Pascal had implied that he might free the young man who'd served him faithfully for 8 years, who'd risked his life in battle for Britain. Instead, Pascal sold him to Captain James Doran of the ship Charming Sally. Just like that, with no explanation and no recourse, Olaudah was put on a vessel bound back to the Caribbean, back to the place where he'd first landed as a terrified child. Back into a world where his reading and writing and naval experience meant nothing compared to the color of his skin. In Montserrat, Captain Doran sold Olaudah to a merchant named Robert King. King was a Quaker from Philadelphia who operated trading vessels throughout the Caribbean and along the North American coast. He claimed to be religious, claimed to oppose slavery in principle. But he owned enslaved people. He bought and sold human beings. He participated in and profited from the system he supposedly found morally troubling. It was a contradiction Olaudah would encounter again and again in his dealings with supposedly enlightened white people. They'd express horror at slavery's brutality while benefiting from slavery's profits. They'd talk about Christian mercy while treating human beings as merchandise. King, to his credit, recognized that Olaudah was unusually skilled. Instead of putting him in the fields or on the docks doing manual labor, King employed him in his stores and on his trading vessels. He taught him accounting and business practices, and, crucially, King allowed Olaudah to engage in his own small trading ventures on the side. This wasn't kindness, it was just pragmatic business. An enslaved person with an incentive to work harder would be more valuable. But it gave Olaudah something he'd never had before, a path to freedom. For 3 years, from 1763 to 1766, Olaudah worked for Robert King while simultaneously working for himself. He bought and sold small quantities of goods, fruits, glassware, tumblers, anything he could turn a profit on. He sailed between Georgia and the Caribbean islands. He traded with Quakers in Philadelphia who, unlike many merchants, didn't cheat him or rob him, or treat him as less than human just because of his race. He saved every penny. King had promised him that when he accumulated 40 pounds, his original purchase price, he could buy his freedom. In 1766, King purchased a larger trading vessel called the Nancy. This gave Olaudah more space to store his merchandise, more capacity to trade, more opportunity to earn. He made a particular profitable voyage to Philadelphia, where he sold his cargo for excellent prices. When he returned to Montserrat, he'd finally saved enough. 47 pounds, more than the 40 he needed. On July 11, 1766, Olaudah Equiano, still legally known as Gustavus Vasa, purchased his own freedom. He was 21 years old. He'd been enslaved for 15 years. The manumission papers were drawn up and signed. Robert King kept his word. Before night, as Olaudah later wrote, I, who had been a slave in the morning, trembling at the will of another, now became my own master and completely free. Think about what that moment must have meant, to go from being property to being a person, to know that no one could sell you, that you could make your own decisions about where to go and what to do, to own yourself. But Olaudah didn't immediately leave the Caribbean. King and the ship's captain asked him to continue working for them as a paid employee, and Olaudah, who'd just achieved the goal he'd been working toward for 3 years, agreed. He signed on as an able-bodied seaman for 36 shillings a month. Maybe he needed the money. Maybe he felt some loyalty to King, who'd at least kept his promise. Or maybe he just wasn't sure what to do next, how to navigate the world as a free black man in the 1760s. Being legally free didn't mean being safe. It didn't mean being equal. In Georgia, while still working for King, Olaudah was attacked by white men who tried to rob him. In Savannah, he witnessed the brutal beating of another free black person for a minor offense. The law didn't protect people who looked like him. Freedom was real, but it was also precarious. In 1767, Olaudah finally sailed for London. He was returning to England as a free man, not as property. Back in London, he worked various jobs. He became a hairdresser to Dr. Charles Irving, a scientist who'd developed a process for distilling seawater. The pay wasn't great, so Olaudah took work at sea, hiring himself out as a steward on merchant vessels traveling to Turkey, Portugal, Italy, and throughout the Mediterranean. In 1773, he joined an Arctic expedition, an attempt to find a northeast passage from Europe to Asia. The voyage failed in its primary objective, but Olaudah added even more experience to his already remarkable resume. He'd now sailed to 4 continents, survived a polar voyage, and mastered the skills of seamanship and trade. In 1776, Dr. Irving recruited Olaudah for a venture in Central America. Irving had bought land on the Mosquito Coast and wanted to establish a plantation. He asked Olaudah to help select enslaved workers and manage them as laborers. Think about that for a moment. Olaudah Equiano, who had been enslaved himself, who knew firsthand the horrors of that system, agreed to work as an overseer on a plantation. It's one of the most troubling episodes in his life story. He would later write about it with some defensiveness, trying to explain that he'd treated the enslaved workers well, that he'd been as fair as possible given the circumstances. But he'd still participated. He'd still been part of the machinery of slavery, even from a position of power rather than powerlessness. The plantation venture failed after about a year. Olaudah returned to London in January 1797. And then something shifted. Maybe it was the experience of being an overseer that forced him to reckon with slavery in a new way. Maybe it was just that he'd reached a point in his life where he could no longer remain silent about what he'd seen and survived. Whatever the reason, Olaudah Equiano began to transform from a sailor and merchant into an activist and advocate. In the 1780s, he became involved with London's black community. There were about 10,000 black people in London at that time, most of them with some connection to slavery, either as escapees, freed people, or servants who'd traveled with their masters. Many of them were struggling to survive in a society that saw them as perpetually foreign, perpetually suspect. Olaudah met other educated, literate black men who were thinking about how to fight the system that had brutalized them. Men like Olaudah Equiano, who'd published his own anti-slavery writings. Together, they formed a group they called the Sons of Africa, probably the first black political organization in British history. The Sons of Africa worked closely with white abolitionists. They wrote letters to newspapers. They organized petitions. They lobbied members of Parliament. They held public meetings where they described their experiences to audiences who'd never heard enslaved people speak for themselves. Olaudah became particularly close with Granville Sharp, one of the leading white abolitionists in Britain. Sharp had been fighting legal battles against slavery since the 1760s, trying to establish through court cases that slavery had no basis in English law. In March 1783, Olaudah brought Sharp information about an atrocity that would galvanize the abolitionist movement, the Zong Massacre. In November 1781, the British slave ship Zong had been sailing from Africa to Jamaica with 442 enslaved Africans packed into its hold. The ship's crew had miscalculated their water supplies. Instead of rationing what they had or making for the nearest port, the captain made a business decision. If enslaved people died of natural causes during the voyage, the ship's owners would have to absorb the loss. But if enslaved people were thrown overboard to save the ship, that could be claimed as insured cargo. So the crew of the Zong threw 142 living human beings into the Atlantic Ocean. Men, women, and children murdered for insurance money. Some of the enslaved people, realizing what was happening, chose to jump rather than be thrown. They committed suicide to maintain some shred of dignity in their final moments. When the case came to court, it wasn't a murder trial. It was an insurance dispute. The ship's owners sued their insurance company for the value of the lost cargo. The enslaved people who'd been murdered weren't treated as victims of a crime. They were treated as damaged goods. The insurance company's lawyer argued that the claim shouldn't be paid because the water shortage was the result of poor navigation. The shipowner's lawyer countered that the captain had made a reasonable decision to preserve the valuable parts of his cargo. At no point did anyone in that courtroom suggest that throwing people into the ocean might be wrong. When Granville Sharp tried to bring murder charges against the Zong's crew, he got nowhere. The legal system saw it as a property dispute, nothing more. But Olaudah and the other members of the Sons of Africa made sure the public heard about it. They wrote letters to newspapers. They told the story in public meetings. They made sure that respectable Londoners knew what was being done in their names, with their money under their flag. The Zong Massacre became a rallying point for the abolitionist movement. It was proof that slavery didn't just harm enslaved people. It corrupted everyone it touched, turned murder into a business calculation, transformed human beings into line items on an insurance claim. By the late 1780s, Olaudah had become a public figure in abolitionist circles. He knew members of Parliament. He'd met the Speaker of the House of Commons and the Prime Minister. He'd built relationships with wealthy philanthropists and religious leaders. And people kept telling him the same thing. You need to write your story. You need to tell people what you experienced. The public needs to hear this from someone who lived through it. So Olaudah sat down and wrote what would become one of the most influential books of the 18th century. The interesting narrative of the life of Olaudah Equiano, or Gustavus Vasa, the African, written by himself. That last part was crucial. Written by himself, because there were people, then and later, who wouldn't believe that a black man could write with such skill, such literary power, such command of English prose. Olaudah had to assert his authorship right there in the title. The book was published in March 1789. Olaudah had funded it through subscriptions. People bought the book before it was finished, essentially pledging their financial support. The list of subscribers reads like a who's who of British society. The Prince of Wales, 8 dukes, members of Parliament, religious leaders, wealthy merchants, but also ordinary people who'd heard Olaudah speak and wanted to support his work. The book was an immediate success. It went through 9 editions during Olaudah's lifetime. It was translated into German, Dutch, and Russian. It became a bestseller, earning Olaudah a comfortable income and giving him financial security he'd never had before. But more importantly, it changed how people thought about slavery. Because here was a book that described the African societies that Europeans claimed were savage and backward. Here was proof that enslaved people were intelligent, articulate, fully human. Here was a first-hand account of the Middle Passage, of plantation slavery, of the casual cruelties and systemic brutalities that white people preferred not to think about. And here was that account in the voice of someone who'd experienced it all, who'd survived it all, who'd somehow managed to become educated and successful despite a system designed to destroy people like him. Olaudah didn't just publish the book and sit back. He went on tour. He traveled throughout England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland, giving lectures, meeting with abolitionist societies, promoting his book, telling his story. He was tireless. He was persuasive. He was exactly what the abolitionist movement needed, a living refutation of every racist justification for slavery. On April 7, 1792, when Olaudah was in his mid-40s, he married a local Englishwoman named Susanna Cullen in St. Andrew's Church in Soham, Cambridgeshire. Susanna was white, from a modest background, the daughter of James and Anne Cullen. The marriage was noted in London newspapers, including the Gentleman's Magazine. It was unusual enough, this union between a prominent black author and a white woman, that it attracted public attention. Olaudah announced his marriage in every subsequent edition of his autobiography. Some historians think he saw it as symbolically important, a representation of the kind of equal partnership he hoped could exist between Africa and Britain, between black and white people, in a world without slavery. Olaudah and Susanna settled in Soham. She accompanied him on his book tours through Scotland, meeting fellow abolitionists, helping him collect new subscribers for his autobiography. In October 1793, she gave birth to their first daughter, Anna Maria. In April 1795, their second daughter, Joanna, was born. But Olaudah's domestic happiness was fragile. In February 1796, Susanna died at the age of 34 after a long illness. She was buried in Soham, her gravestone bearing the inscription Susanna Vasa, wife of Gustavus the African, aged 34 years. Olaudah was left to care for 2 young daughters alone. He arranged for their care and continued his abolitionist work, but the loss had clearly affected him. Just over a year later, on March 31, 1797, Olaudah Equiano died in London. He was about 52 years old. His burial place isn't known. A few months after his death, his older daughter Anna Maria died, probably from measles, at just 4 years old. She was buried at St. Andrew's Church in Chesterton, Cambridge, where a memorial poem was placed on the wall, describing her as the daughter of an African father, born of Afric's sunburnt race. Young Joanna was the only surviving member of Olaudah's immediate family. She inherited his estate, valued at about £950, a considerable sum equivalent to more than £80,000 today. That inheritance, the product of book sales and lecture tours and careful financial management, meant that Joanna grew up in relative comfort. In 1821, she married Henry Bromley, a Congregationalist minister. Her gravestone, when she died in 1857 at age 61, identified her as the beloved wife of Henry Bromley, daughter of Gustavus Vasa the African. Even 60 years after his death, Olaudah's identity, his story, his significance, remained important enough to inscribe in stone. But what about the book itself? What about the story Olaudah told? Here's where things get complicated. In the early 2000s, a historian named Vincent Carretta discovered two documents that seemed to contradict Olaudah's account: a baptismal record and a naval muster roll that listed him as being from South Carolina, not Africa. Carretta suggested that maybe Olaudah had invented the African portions of his narrative. Maybe he'd been born in the Americas and had constructed an African identity because it served the needs of the abolitionist movement. Maybe the whole story of his childhood in Osaka, his kidnapping, his memories of Igbo society, maybe all of that was fiction based on other people's accounts. It's worth being clear about what we know and what we don't know. Those documents exist. They do list South Carolina as Olaudah's place of origin. But other historians have pointed out several things. First, those records were created by white officials who often didn't care about accuracy when it came to enslaved people. Second, many specific details in Olaudah's narrative match up with documented information about the slave trade in the 1750s. Third, it was common for enslaved people to be listed as coming from wherever they'd most recently been sold, not from their original homeland. Fourth, Olaudah had no particular reason to lie about being African-born when he wrote his book. If anything, being born in America might have made him seem more sympathetic to British readers. And fifth, autobiographies are always complex documents. Memory is fallible. People construct their life stories in ways that make sense to them, that serve their purposes. That doesn't mean they're deliberately lying. It means they're human. The historian Adam Hochschild made an important point about this controversy. In the long history of autobiographies that distort or exaggerate the truth, he wrote, "Seldom is one crucial portion of a memoir totally fabricated, and the remainder scrupulously accurate. Both dissemblers and truth-tellers tend to be consistent, and Olaudah's narrative is remarkably consistent with documented facts about his later life. His service with Pascal, his time with Robert King, his purchase of freedom, his Arctic voyage, his involvement with the Sons of Africa, all of that can be verified. Why would he invent only the African portions and tell the truth about everything else? More importantly, why are we so focused on this question? Why does it matter so much whether Olaudah Equiano was born in Africa or South Carolina? The answer, probably, is that we want our heroes to be uncomplicated. We want clear-cut stories with no ambiguities. But history doesn't work that way. People don't work that way. Olaudah Equiano was a real person who lived a remarkable life. He was enslaved as a child, whether that happened in Africa or America. He endured the Middle Passage, or he heard detailed accounts from people who did and was traumatized enough by slavery that those accounts became part of his own memory. He purchased his freedom through determination and intelligence. He became one of the leading voices in the abolitionist movement. He wrote a book that changed public opinion and helped bring about the end of the British slave trade. That's what matters. Because here's the thing. The Slave Trade Act of 1807 abolished Britain's participation in the transatlantic slave trade. 10 years after Olaudah died, the British government made it illegal for British ships to transport enslaved Africans across the Atlantic. That law didn't end slavery itself in British colonies. That would take another 26 years. And it didn't stop other countries from continuing the trade. But it was a crucial step. And Olaudah Equiano's narrative was one of the key factors that made it possible. Members of Parliament cited his book in their speeches. Abolitionists used his descriptions of the Middle Passage to argue for the trade's end. The public read his story and couldn't easily dismiss the humanity of enslaved people anymore. Olaudah had taken his trauma, his survival, his hard-won education and freedom, and he'd turned it into a weapon against the system that had brutalized him. He'd written his way out of slavery, and then he'd used his writing to help dismantle slavery for others. Think about the trajectory of his life. Kidnapped at 11, enslaved for 15 years, free at 21. A sailor, a merchant, briefly an overseer, an activist in his 30s and 40s, an author who became a bestseller, a husband and father, a public speaker who addressed thousands, a man who met prime ministers and princes, a man who died with an estate worth nearly £1 million in today's money, a man whose daughter proudly identified herself as his child 60 years after his death. That's not the story we usually tell about enslaved people. We tend to focus on their suffering, on their victimization, on the horrors inflicted upon them. And those horrors were real. Olaudah experienced and witnessed terrible things. But he was more than a victim. He was a survivor who built a life for himself despite every obstacle. He was an intellectual who used his education as a tool for liberation. He was an organizer who built coalitions across racial lines. He was a writer who understood the power of storytelling to change minds and hearts. He was complicated. He made choices that we might question today, like working as an overseer on that Mosquito Coast plantation. He operated within systems of power and privilege, even as he worked to dismantle them. He benefited financially from telling his story of suffering. He may have shaped or altered parts of that story to make it more effective as political rhetoric. He was human. And maybe that's the most important thing to understand about Olaudah Equiano. He wasn't a saint. He wasn't a perfect symbol. He was a man who'd been reduced to property by a brutal economic system, who'd somehow maintained his sense of self through years of trauma, who'd found ways to resist and survive and eventually thrive. And he'd done it not by separating himself from the world that had enslaved him, but by engaging with it, by learning its languages and customs, by becoming skilled at the very things his enslavers valued, and then using those skills against the system itself. There's a reason his book was called The Interesting Narrative, rather than the tragic narrative or the horrific narrative. Interest, in 18th century English, meant something different than it does now. It meant personal stake, financial investment, benefit. Olaudah was telling readers that they had an interest in his story, that slavery wasn't just something that happened to faraway people, but something that implicated everyone in British society. That the sugar in their tea, the tobacco in their pipes, the cotton in their clothes, all of it was connected to the suffering he described. That they had a choice to make about what kind of society they wanted to live in. And people listened. Not everyone, obviously. The slave trade continued for years after his book was published. Slavery itself persisted for decades. But enough people listened that the political calculation began to shift. Enough people read his story and couldn't maintain the comfortable fiction that enslaved people were fundamentally different from them, that slavery was a necessary evil or even a positive good. Olaudah Equiano didn't single-handedly end slavery. That required the work of thousands of activists over many decades. But he was one of the key figures who made abolition thinkable, who provided the moral and intellectual ammunition that abolitionists needed to win their arguments. Today, more than 200 years after his death, Olaudah Equiano's narrative remains in print. It's taught in universities around the world. It's recognized as one of the foundational texts of Black literature, one of the first examples of what would become a whole genre of slave narratives. Scholars debate the details of his birthplace, but no one debates his impact. His story matters. Not because he was perfect, but because he was real. Not because he transcended his circumstances, but because he engaged with them fully, strategically, with clear-eyed determination to not just survive, but to use his survival for a larger purpose. He took the name they'd forced on him, Gustavus Vasa, and he used it to build a platform. Then he reclaimed his original name, Olaudah Equiano, and put it on the cover of a book that would outlast everyone who'd ever owned him. That's a particular kind of victory. A quiet one, maybe, but profound. He made sure his story would be told in his own words. He made sure the world would know what had been done to him and to millions of others. He made sure that future generations would read his account and understand that enslaved people were writers, thinkers, businessmen, fathers, husbands, friends, were human. In 2007, Britain commemorated the bicentenary of the 1807 Slave Trade Act. Olaudah Equiano was featured on postage stamps. Memorials were erected. His story was taught in schools. In 2022, the city of Cambridge renamed a bridge in his honor, the Equiano Bridge. These aren't just empty gestures. They're recognitions that his voice, his words, his refusal to be silenced or erased changed the course of history. The man who was stolen from his home at 11, who survived the Middle Passage, who was renamed and sold and brutalized, who somehow found ways to learn and grow and resist, that man wrote his way into the permanent record. And in doing so, he wrote a path toward freedom, not just for himself, but for millions who would come after him,